of this conference. Isn't that fantastic? Well, it's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Ursula Kilkelly, who hails from the School of Law at the University College Cork. She has an expertise in international children's rights law, having published extensively on her own and in edited collections and journals over the last 25 years on children's rights and youth justice. She's recently published an international review of the legal incorporation of the UNCRC with Laura Lundy and Brona Byrne, which is of particular relevance to us here in Scotland as we go through that process, and has co-authored 2 monographs, one with Emily Logan, Ireland's first Ombudsman for Children on national children's rights institutions, and another with Pat Bergen, the first director of Oberstown Children Detention Campus on advancing children's rights in detention. The latter book presents Ursula's model for advancing children's rights in detention and details the learning from implementing this model in the Irish national context. Relevant to this, Ursula has been the chairperson of the Board of Management of Oberstown since 2016, was recently appointed a chartered director by the Institute of Directors. She teaches children's rights and youth justice on the LLM, Children's Rights and Family Law at the University College Cork. Welcome, Professor Kilkelly. I'm going to hand over to you now, and we look forward to hearing from you on a rights-based model for detention of children, challenges and opportunities.
Thank you, David. Can everybody hear me okay? I hope the sound is okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
And I don't know about everybody else, but I'm not hearing you, Professor Kilkelly.
It's not my mute. I'm not muted. So
I wonder.
No, you're actually. You can hear yourself. I can hear you too.
I have to.
We're okay. Are we okay?
Hand over to any other bodies with technical knowledge who might help us here.
Consistent with the international reach of the conference, I'm actually in Tromsø in Norway. So maybe the distance is causing us some challenges, but I hope you can hear me okay. Great. Look, it's a great pleasure to be with you at this really important conference, and I want to thank and also applaud the organisers for your vision in setting out a rights-based model as the ambition for Scotland in this really important area. And I know there's been a huge amount of really good work done, and I've been part of some of that discussion, and I want to, I suppose, give you further food for thought perhaps on where you might go specifically with regard to detention. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this will be visible to everybody.
Yes, we can see that. Thank you.
Okay, great. And as David said, I'm coming at this from at least 2 different perspectives. One is my academic background and my knowledge and experience of children's rights in the context of youth justice and detention. But it's also coming with nearly a decade now of experience on the board of Oberstown Children Detention Campus, which is our national facility for the remand and detention of children under 18. And in particular, a process of reform and change that I've led there with the director, formerly Pat Bergen, and now Damien Hernan, to embed a rights-based approach into practice, and I suppose in a really in an ambitious way to set the standard for how children experience their rights in detention. It goes without saying, though, that notwithstanding the ambiguity of detention in the context of rights in the Convention, it is not in children's interests to be detained in the main. This is not a case for the detention of children, and we need to be really careful that this is on the basis of detention as a last resort and for the shortest appropriate period of time. But I do think we have a responsibility to acknowledge that in some instances, detention will be an appropriate response, particularly with regard to those young people who have become involved in very serious violent offending, and that its potential can be maximized in those very limited cases. So we need to retain the level of ambition we have for children and extending it to those really at the deep end and who suffer and great harm and have in some instances caused great harm. So it's with that in mind that I wanted to speak to you today. You all know this, of course, the extent of the international standards and obligations on states with regard to the implementation of children's rights, both generally and with specific reference to youth justice and to detention. The convention talks, as I said, about detention as a last resort, so it doesn't prohibit detention, which is interesting. It talks about it as a last resort for the shortest appropriate period of time. But it sets down very particular standards for how children should be treated, should experience their rights in detention. And they have a fundamental right to be treated with dignity and respect, and in a way that takes account of their age and stage of development and the overriding imperative of reintegration. I think that's a really important principle in the convention when it talks about detention. It is all about trying to ensure that what we do during those months and sometimes years readies a child, a young person, for the best possible chance in their lives ahead. Substantive rights are, as the general comment makes clear, really critically important. Children don't leave their rights to health, to education, to protection from harm at the gate of any detention facility. They continue to apply, and as our model shows, they're fundamentally important. The general principles, especially Article 2, non-discrimination, 3, best interest, and 12, the right to have a say in decisions that affect them, are absolutely key, and they must drive any articulation of a rights-based approach to detention. And then there's some really important standards set with regard to children's rights in detention that really are enabling and supportive elements. The very strong emphasis on the need for specialist staff who are trained and supported to do their jobs, critically important but challenging work. The whole area of complaints, so that we acknowledge the vulnerability of children in detention, particularly given its secure environment and the fact that it may well be less visible as a result. So the whole process of ensuring accountability through both complaints and, I would say, also to inspection is really important, and ensuring that those processes are rights-based is really key. Other standards, which I won't go into, but just to say that there is a whole range, as many of you will know, of really valuable guidance and detailed standards on how children are to experience their rights in detention, and how we are to be held accountable for the implementation of those rights. But notwithstanding the very, I think, important breadth of international children's rights standards, what we know from research and from hugely important civil society and NGO activity is that the breaches of children's rights are common in places of detention. And it just obviously epitomized by the volume of children's experiences documented in the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Their Liberty, published in 2019, but also in your own jurisdiction too, and wider, the really problematic way in which children's rights are breached in detention is something we have long since documented and lamented, I think, in equal measure. You know, I've just flagged a few of the really critical concerns here. Overuse of detention, what I would say is either disproportionate impact on children from particularly vulnerable backgrounds, who are trauma experienced, who are from minority groups, the overuse of detention, inappropriate use of detention. We've all grappled with the overuse of detention on remand in particular, seeing a level of detention among that group that's not justified or warranted. and often does not follow a sentence of detention following a court process. Particularly critical is, I think, a continued use of prison or adult type facilities. And what we see, particularly across the United States, but also in European jurisdictions, is that older children and those who have been found to have committed very serious violent offences are most likely to spend their time in the most inappropriate environment, adult type or jail type facilities, as they've described them in the United States. We're all very familiar with poor regime, with behaviour management that is restrictive, that is control focused, and frankly, from time to time can be dangerous. And so the overuse of restraint, the use of pain compliant, for example, forms of restraint, and the use of in different forms of separation, isolation, segregation, all of those really highly restrictive forms of measures, which may from time to time be used as punishment. So all of this combines in a really sometimes disastrous way to make detention and not just a deeply unpleasant and uncaring place for children and young people, but sometimes to a dangerous place. And we know the level of safety can be linked to the extent of these practices, which are in themselves often highly risky. What we see then is this sort of absence of a child-centered approach. And really, I know that you're hearing from Steve Case tomorrow, but that sense of ensuring that children are treated as children in places of detention is often missing. And I said, particularly for older and those who are involved in more serious types of offending. What we see also, and less well documented in a way, is children's complex and sometimes even their basic needs not being met. Interestingly, when we talked to children as part of the UN Global Study, this came out really strongly, and that yes, children were receiving education, but it wasn't the education they believed they needed to get on in life when they left. So really looking to tailor education, health, and other supports and therapeutic interventions to children's needs is really, really key. And putting a responsibility, I think, on the child at times to reform without really appreciating what the authorities, what we must do to ensure those needs are met. And of course, we see through all of that vulnerability, children being hidden, either having ineffective or no access to complaints mechanisms that are accountable or that are external, a lack of advocacy and engagement with young people, and a failure to take their views, their perspectives seriously to ensure they have a say in the decision making. So in short, we know what's wrong. The question is, though, what we do about it. And you may be familiar with some, but you may also be in other contexts familiar with all of these sorts of concerns. So the question, and this was the question for us, I guess, when confronted with many of these issues, and back in 2013-14, was what could we do about it? And Ireland's experience, documented through both our annual reports, but also our independent inspection reports, shows year on year incremental change and reform towards a rights-based model. And the book that David kindly mentioned at the outset tells that story of where we came from, where we are now, and how that we experienced that journey. In short, highlighting some of the key elements of that process, Ireland had in 2001 adopted a new law following on from its ratification of the convention, which set out very clearly that detention was to be rights-based and focused on care, education, health and well-being. And it set out in particular an ambition that all children would experience that model. And as part of that, closing and ending the imprisonment of children. And so following on from that, we had various national policy documents which filled in the gaps as to how that was to be achieved, and committed to a level of resourcing and political support for the change process that we were asked to lead. And that process of reform then, drawing from the convention and drawing from both law and policy, was really a commitment to embedding a child-centered and rights-based approach to detention into place. It came with it a substantial capital investment. So following on from a review of the national need and I think the value of scale and of critical mass, there was a decision to, perhaps controversially, establish a single facility that would have the kind of resources associated with a modern facility, state-of-the-art health and education, and new leadership. And that was to be, again, a critical part of the reform process. Through the process and taking the legislation off the shelf, as it were, there was a commitment to an integrated model of care where the child's needs would be assessed on admission, and a whole process of placement planning would take place in an interdisciplinary and multi-professional setting to ensure the child's needs across all aspects of their lives were being met, and that those were then managed and supported through a care planning process towards the child leaving. I think what was, what was most important ultimately was apart from all of these services, which I'll come back to, was this realization that until staff felt safe, until they felt supported and resourced to do their jobs, felt respected in their workplace, we weren't going to be able to ensure that that the children's rights were respected day to day. So we placed huge emphasis on staff well-being, and do place great emphasis on staff well-being and development and support in a very holistic way. And I think we've shown how critically important that is to the respect for children's rights in practice. And as I said, that systematic year-on-year progress, which came through our inspection reports, many of which made during those years for very difficult reading. So a very rigorous process of evaluating the extent to which we were meeting the standards that were set, but the independent verification of those of that progress was really important. And you can see even the latest 2021 report, a real, I think, a step change in the quality of care and the nature of care that young people receive. So what we have now is, I would like to think at least, documented in the HICWA report, professional specialist service that is child-centred and rights-based. And critically, it is for all children under 18 years. So regardless of the nature of their offending or their own particular, perhaps, circumstances, they're all accommodated in Overstan, and the single, with the result, of course, that children are no longer sent to prison, and the facility in particular that accommodated 16 and 17-year-olds was closed. And we did that on a gradual basis over several years, taking the 16-year-olds and then the 17-year-olds, and the law was changed quite recently to allow us to keep those up to about 18 and a half. And I think that's an area where we'll be looking to push the boundaries as we go on. In terms of the model, just my screen isn't actually moving here now. There we go. So you'll see the model that was developed through this work, the five Ps, starts with the child-centered care as a cornerstone, and it then has the 5 Ps that are set out there: provision, protection, preparation, partnership, and participation. All of those are really centered on or based on a fundamental approach that is child-centered, supported by our law and policy, by resources, and by staffing and by strategy. So the book talks about those different elements and how important they were. And more recently, in 2020, we adopted the Children's Rights Policy Framework, which is an entirely new rights-based policy for the entire facility, for the entire campus, sets out the rights to which children are entitled under 12 areas, sets out the responsibilities of staff, management and board to deliver on those rights. And I think really, really critically, the inspectorate, the National Inspectorate, has picked that up and created an inspection framework from the children's rights policy base that we have in Oberstown. So we are now being inspected against a rights framework. So that can only serve to further embed the rights-based approach into what we do. Just to give you some examples, I suppose, of what these principles mean in practice. I mentioned provision of health and education, and what we see here is apart from very comprehensive health and education facilities in Oberstown, we have an integrated approach through the care planning process that makes sure that whatever health needs the young person has, from dentistry to physiotherapy to clinical care, psychology, speech and language therapy, substance misuse, psychiatry, all of those are available in an interdisciplinary way on campus week by week. In terms of education, we have a fantastic education facility and a holistic approach to education, which combines curriculum and academic curriculum, if you like, school curriculum, state exams and so on, with an emphasis on vocational training and development, which also combines with the personal development. So all of those in a very integrated way are really set out with the young person what they want to achieve while they're with us and how best that can be supported. So just to give you an example of our integrated approach, we have a facilities manager who obviously is responsible for the upkeep and the maintenance of our facilities. He runs an apprenticeship program for young people who are interested in training in decoration and painting. Equally, in our kitchens, we have, again, an apprenticeship program for those who are interested in working in catering, in restaurants and so on. So with every opportunity, we try to combine personal interest, personal development with vocational training and the qualification that the young person will have when they leave. In terms of protection, there's been some really important work done to create a more safe environment for young people. And that's really fundamentally been about culture change. In my experience, you will not reduce the level of restrictive practices or unsafe practices without a complete change of the culture of an organization, to the point for us now where we have I think that the figures are something like 10% of the figures that we had 6 years ago in relation to restrictive practices. Physical intervention are occasional occurrences, really selectively used to create an opportunity for a young person to come back to their baseline behavior. So really selective, highly trained, monitored and supervised existence or use of these practices. You can't obviously eliminate all risk, but through that process of demanding a level of training, of support, of reflection on existing practice when things happen, when things go wrong, all of that culture of learning been critically important to change the way in which we view the use of these practices, insisting that they really are isolated as much as possible as an approach. Preparation for leaving is really critical, important. I mentioned that already. I won't say much more about that other than to say that it is, going back to the CRC, the key component that drives everything. Preparing the young person for leaving starts the day they come in. And I think that's crucially important, not just to the vocational development and personal development, but also that whole process of addressing the elements of the young person's experience and life that have ended in them being involved in the offending behavior in the first instance. The two last ones, partnership, I think have over time appreciated as a really fundamental part of the experience. And you will know the CRC is very clear about the role of family and parents. Whether it's Article 18 or Article 5, it's really well recognized that only those opportunities that children have to address their circumstances, those that involve families and partnerships with the community, will have a lasting impact. And so we see partnership as a fundamental principle in the way we work. And then finally, participation, which, you know, I know there's been some great work done in this area in Scotland of late. We have our structures, we have our residential unit meetings, we have our campus council with young people all to get together. We have various opportunities for young people to feed in, to be consulted about their experiences. But it's really now at the point where we want to get to of ensuring that this is the day-to-day lived experience of young people through the work of our advocacy officer, which some of you will know about. And I think the high point of this for me was that we involve young people in the recruitment of the new director when that was undertaken in 2021, having the young people engage with their peers on what they wanted to see in a new director, and then developing a question frame the two of them then used as formal weighted part of the interview process for the new director. Young people who had never done anything like this in their lives before, and really saw huge value in it, and the candidates too, of course. The process was significantly improved as a result. And then we've passed that. We've moved on to the next level of recruitment. So other members of the senior management team also have this component as part of it. And we see that as crucial, ensuring that young people have a say in decisions that are really critical and will last long beyond their time with us. And so they're a brief sort of outline of the 5 key elements. I suppose to the challenges and opportunities by way of conclusion. I think it's easier to write the challenges because we know the opportunity. We know what is available to the young people and to the model that we offer through the implementation of this work in practice. It goes probably without saying, but this kind of change is extraordinarily difficult. It's complex and it is endless. The work is not done. The work is actually never done. You have to keep tending to the small things every day to make sure the process continues on track. There's no book. I mean, we hope that ours is a rule book of sorts. We hope we do offer some pathway to those who want to put in place a more ambitious, progressive approach for young people in detention. But you're going to have to adapt and develop that, obviously, for your own circumstances. Our learning is that people are crucially important, whether it's our external stakeholders, whether it's government, whether it's the staff who work with us and do the really important work in the facility, people at every level, and the young people obviously retaining and ensuring that they are centrally involved and are the center of all that we are doing is really important. We make some reflections in the book on public scrutiny. This will always be in the public eye. There will always be an interest from the public, from media, from Parliament in what we do. That can be really, really difficult, especially if you're in the midst of very challenging change. But it also can be harnessed to create positive momentum. Interestingly for us, everybody, bar one group, the CPT, demanded or expected us to move faster than we did. The Committee for the Prevention of Torture was the only body that said, you need to take your time. So it's worth thinking about that and what kind of process of change you envisage, what supports you need in place to enable that to happen. The other point I would make is that detention, while it's an isolated part or a standalone part of the youth justice system to a large extent, it also can help drive change in other areas and reform in other areas. And I think how it remains connected to the other aspects of both the criminal justice system in terms of transition to prison for those who go there, or in terms of the other aspects of the court process. We've done some really interesting work recently with young people in detention in engaging with the court process. So retaining that connection is really important. And ultimately, you know, sharing the experience that we all have, staying connected internationally to each other is really important. And that's where the opportunity is, to maximize the potential of all of this beyond a single experience, which is just ours, to something that is more globally relevant, applicable, and adapted to the national context. So I hope those observations and reflections are of interest, and I'd be really keen to hear any questions anyone has, or to answer any particular queries. So thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Kilkelly, thank you so much for that presentation. You've squeezed